Hello everyone, it's Sunday morning, and as you can see from the picture behind me, the beast from the east has returned to our little neck of the woods. I just thought I'd come outside and do a little bit of filming before I do the main podcast proper. It's not too bad today actually, although it's cold obviously and there's snow everywhere. Yesterday we had it's actually been nicknamed the mini beast from the east. It was bitingly cold winds yesterday and little bits of snowfall, but nothing very particular. But then last night at about 10 o'clock it started to snow, and it had stopped by this morning, but as you can see there's a nice little layer of snow to cheer everybody up this Sunday morning. I'm very glad I'm not going to work today. I have every hope and expectation that although it is still blowing very cold, things should warm up quite quickly now again, and spring will be back with us. As you can see, there's Tootsie, and behind Tootsie is Bob and Wendy's car. They're parking on this side at the moment because they're having, there is some work being done on their building which has required scaffolding, which is in their parking space. It's not actually their flat. There's apparently a leak in the top floor flat, and so they're fixing the roof, although as Bob and Wendy have said, they don't seem to be doing very much. But the scaffolding has been up for a couple of weeks now. Anyway, so I'm going to go back inside because I'm only wearing a light jacket. I just thought I'd pop out and show you the snow. It's a bit chilly, so I'm just going to go back indoors, and then I will set up my recording equipment and tripod and things, and I'll start recording the next episode. So we'll just take a little walk around so you can see how pretty everything is in the snow. I mean, we've had a few cars come out now, so there are track marks and people have been walking through, but there we are. So Abingdon-on-Thames in the snow. Right, I'm off inside now before I freeze to death, and I will see you all shortly. So bye for now. So we're back inside and it's much warmer. It's also later in the afternoon from when I recorded that little bit this morning, and the snow is pretty much, it's not quite all gone, it's still on the grass, but on the pavements and roads it's all melted away. So it was a very short-lived little wintry episode. So I should take this opportunity, of course, to introduce myself and to welcome you all to this little rambling conversation on life and the fibre arts. My name is Gerard, or Peter, or Boniface. I am a former monk and a former bus driver. I live in Abingdon-on-Thames in Oxfordshire in the southeast of England. We're about 7 miles south of the city of Oxford. I live with my two cats, Bunty, who's asleep next to me here, and Toby, who's asleep on the bed over there. And I have a housemate who is a friend and colleague, and his two sons are staying with us this weekend, so I've closed the bedroom door to give us a bit of privacy while I record. They're currently it's very weird, they're currently playing some kind of game which they're playing with a friend of theirs back home in Tame, where they live. And Thomas is on the computer, Samuel's on the laptop, and they're communicating via the iPod with their friend on a computer. And I mean, this is obviously the modern way of playing computer games. What strikes me as really interesting is the graphics on these computer games are very reminiscent of the kind of 1980s computer games that we used to play. I used to play. I don't know whether any of you used to play. They're quite blocky, pixelated, not very well, cartoonish almost in the quality, naive cartoon at that. And they're very big fans of Minecraft games as well, which have a very similar kind of graphic. And I just find it an odd juxtaposition, particularly with the Minecraft, that they will play the Minecraft games on a PS4, the Sony PlayStation 4, which is an octo-core processor, so it has 8 microprocessing units in the central processing unit, which means that they can have processes dedicated to graphics, rendering, and the game action and all that kind of thing, as well as the inputs from the players and also bringing in data from online services. And it just seems an odd juxtaposition to have a high-powered computer playing really quite primitive games in a sense. So it's just an interesting observation about those things. Anyway, that's not what this podcast is about. So welcome to any new viewers. I hope you enjoy spending some time with me today. Excuse me. And welcome also to my returning viewers. It's always nice to know that you're out there and interested in what I have to say and what I'm doing. So, without any further ado, no, I will have a bit of more further ado. Last weekend in the United Kingdom, we celebrated Mothering Sunday, which today has become more the kind of Mother's Day event that I'm sure many of you in other parts of the world will be familiar with, where we celebrate the role of the mother. It's always held in the UK on the fourth Sunday of Lent. The fourth Sunday of Lent is Mothering Sunday. And the original idea behind Mothering Sunday was that for many children who had grown up and were put into service in other households, they weren't always in the same district where they had, or parish rather, where they had grown up. And so once a year they returned to their mother church. And that day was the fourth Sunday of Lent. And of course, if you return to your mother church for the day, then you return to your mother as well. And so the two ideas became very closely interlinked, and in fact the former idea has now more or less died away completely, and Mothering Sunday is now effectively Mother's Day. But it's just an interesting little history of its origin there. And so it is actually not a celebration that was invented by Hallmark or any other big card companies, as is often an accusation laid against the lesser celebrations like Valentine's Day and Mother's Day and Father's Day, I guess by extension. Mothering Sunday has a strong purpose in its origin, which has kind of been hijacked by the idea of mothers rather than Mother Church, but actually they're both the nurture concept. So it's a minor step away from Mothering Sunday to Mother's Day. Anyway, last Mother's Day, unfortunately, my own mother collapsed at home and was unconscious for a period of time. My brother was obviously very, very worried and upset, and paramedics attended and managed to revive her. She's had CT scans and all kinds of other things. We thought it was a stroke, and it appears that it wasn't. We've no idea what it was, but she has been referred to a neurologist. So I'd be very grateful if you could remember her, and particularly my brother, in your prayers and thoughts at this time. It was obviously, as I say, a great shock to him. Fortunately for her, I phoned her the next day, and she simply had no recollection of it, which, you know, is not. Whilst on the one hand it shows how strong is the effect that Alzheimer's is having on her, on the other hand it also shows that not all of the effects are necessarily always bad, that the lack of recollection of short-term events can sometimes be a blessing as much as a curse. Anyway, I don't have any finished objects of my own. For some reason, I didn't bother finishing the bunny rabbit, so it's still... I say that. I've finished all the individual parts. I've got to make the costume and sew it all together, but for some reason, I just haven't done that. So, sorry, I don't have any finished objects to show you. I do, however, have two from Wendy. So, the first one, segueing nicely from Mother's Day, was a Mother's Day gift from Wendy to her mother, which is a table runner, and I'll put the picture in here for you. I mean, Wendy is an incredibly talented sewer. I know from a few American and Canadian podcasts that people don't like the word sewer because, as it's spelt, it also looks like the word sewer. I've grown up with the word sewer. I guess if it were written down, it would be a confusion, and therefore I understand why the word sewist is used, and I have no particular difficulty with the idea of sewist, except I'm a knitter, a crocheter, and a sewer. So, mutates mutat. No, not. What's the phrase I'm looking for? I got suckered into that one. Then it's not. I can't remember what the phrase is. Anyway, I'll probably cut that little bit out. So I use the word sewer rather than the word sewist. It's just the word that is most familiar to me and the one that has been a part of my background. But as I say, I have no difficulty at all with the word sewist, and I quite understand why some people don't want to be described as a sewer when they're actually a sewer. Anyway, that was a semantic diversion. Wendy has a very good eye for colours in particular, I find. And I know she follows patterns and the like, but I'm trying to encourage her at the moment to set up an Etsy shop for some of the bits and pieces she makes, because they're really good. And it can be very difficult selling things locally, which is the easiest way to sell things in some respects, because postage and the like can be kept to a minimum. But in fact, I think some of what she produces is really good quality. I mean, everything she produces is really good quality, but I think some of it is really commercially saleable. And so I'm encouraging her at the moment, and I think I've been doing a little bit of research for her on things like VAT and income tax reporting and so on. And it doesn't look as though it's too complicated. It's just has to be done within certain time frames, particularly in the UK. I don't know the situation in other parts of the world, but in the UK, I think you can sell up to £86,000 worth of products before you have to be VAT registered. So if you're not VAT registered, then although you're selling luxury items, you don't have to charge VAT. So that's quite positive. And again, with selling items, the personal tax allowance for an individual is nearly £12,000 a year. So you'd have to be really selling a lot of stuff or very valuable stuff for it to start becoming a liability as such. So anyway, we're talking about that, and as you can see from the picture, she has a very good eye, as I said. She's a very fine sewer. The other finished object is a child's cardigan. With a shawl collar, very much I think a boy's cardigan from the look. The wool is the yarn she's used is very pretty yarn. It's all on a single ball skein. I don't know what's wrong with me today. My mind seems to be shorting out every so often. It is a James C. Brett, and I think it's Fairground. I think it's called Fairground. It's a really nice pattern that it produces, as you can see on the picture. And the pattern that Wendy followed was a little bit complicated. I'm sorry, today I've just been excessively tired for some reason. Sorry about that. The pattern that she followed it's a very nice pattern, but the collar itself, the instructions were a little bit, they weren't as clear as they could have been, I think, and it caused a little bit of concern, to the point where she actually knitted a different kind of button band and collar, because the instructions just didn't seem to work, and then she reread the instructions, and eventually it kind of all clicked. And for me, is a very odd thing. It's not knit in a single continuous up one side, around the back and down the other. It's actually knit from the two bases to the middle of the back. So you then seam at the back, which again is fine, but I'm not quite sure why that would be the case. It does produce that interesting difference of colour on the two sides, which again, it's not an issue. Sorry about this. I'm really not tired. Sorry. But I just think it's very it's a very pretty little jacket, and I really like the wool, so I think I might have to make something along those lines myself. So those are the two finished objects. Whips, I have completed the heel on my socks, and I'm currently just going up the two sides. These are 2 at a time socks, and look, they're still separate, which is a very positive thing. I've only once more used the same wool to go across. Fortunately, I'm so sorry. Oh dear, sorry about this. It's I just have days when waves of lethargy just wash over me. I don't understand why. It just happens. I slept very well last night. I don't have any issues sleeping. I just have these days. I mean, when I was... I'll come back to these in a moment. When I was ill, well, that's what, 18 months ago now, more than 18 months ago. No, 18 months ago. Yeah, it was September. It was June to December, so September 18 months ago. I was sleeping for 17 hours a day, which was one of the reasons we knew I was so unwell. In the last 12 months, certainly, I've not had that level of sleepiness, but I do apologise. Oh dear, I really don't know where this is coming from. It's just washes over me. Bob noted a couple of episodes ago that I have my panda eyes back, and I think I can see that I have them again today. My dad always referred to them as panda eyes because I'm always very white, very pale, and then I get these really black, deep-set eyes. So anyway, it's just the way it is. I mean, what are you going to do? Cry? So just occasionally I do get these days of, oh dear me, I do. Oh dear, oh goodness me, I do apologise. I'm going to have to see if I can cut out some of the yawning for you. I'm fine, I'm not ill, but it just happens. Anyway, so pheasant colourway, Blueface Leicester. I love the striping on them. I love the colours on them. I love the way the heels have worked up. There's one and there's the other, so they've actually worked up almost in 2 triangles, but opposites, which is quite nice. I'm doing a 3x1 rib. I did a couple of rows after I'd rejoined. So when I do wraps and turns for the heels just in short rows, and then I pick up an extra stitch when I have gone back and lifted up all the wraps and finished the heel. I then pick up an extra stitch between on both sides just to avoid a hole, and as you can see there is no hole there. And then on the next round I just knit 2 together to get rid of the extra stitch. I then knit, I think, yes, the whole of the next colour I did just in stockinette, and then I switched to the 3x1 rib, which just gives it a degree of stretch, but not as much gripping in as the 2x2 or 1x1 rib, which is just nicer for a sock, I think. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. I do apologise, I really do. So I don't have a lot left. There is enough there to do quite a decent leg. The advantage is I've already split the wool, so I know there's 50 grams in each, and I'll just keep going until I'm at the end of the wool. So that's in my Mrs. Brown's bag sock sack, which I'm very pleased with. So that's my works in progress. I think I'll talk about my acquisitions, partly because the tea I'm drinking today is Twining's blackcurrant and blueberry, I think. Yes, blackcurrant and blueberry, which is very refreshing. This came in a parcel that was delivered to me, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So, excuse me. I'll just pour the other cup now. Bear with me a second, I do apologise. That's good. There we are. So I'll talk about that acquisition first then, which I did start doing a little bit of spinning this week. I haven't quite got to grips with it yet, so I've not really got anything concrete to show you. But I did go online, and because I saw this, I think on Instagram, and I thought, ooh, I have to have that. So I bought wool before from this person. She's a dyer and a spinner herself. So she dyes both top, so the fluff bit before it becomes yarn, but also the yarn. So she has, this is her, she is Crafty Cat Knitty Bits, and it's called, well, the company is Crafty Cat Fibre. This is a Kent Romney top. I'm sorry, you're getting shadow there, I'll put it that way around. It's a Kent Romney top, which is, it's 100% Romney sheep wool. I do have an explanation of that, which I'll read to you in a moment. I just loved the colours, the greens, the teals, the magentas and the purples in this are just really stunning. So I'm basically practicing on just white and grey wool, so it's not particularly significant, but that's one that I really do want to spin up to make into some, what I think will be some stunning yarn. So she is Crafty Cat Fibres, and she is on Instagram and Facebook and various, and Etsy as well, I think, as Crafty Cat Knitty Bits. And she also sent me this lovely pin, a button badge, which is, I don't know if that's actually focusing. If I go behind it, I can't get the camera to focus. I've got my glasses with me, Bob, don't worry. And it says, I spin yarns, and it's a picture of a spinning wheel. So yeah, there you go, you can see it now. So that will be going on my lovely bag that I keep my tops, my spinning walls and tops, not spinning tops, yeah, and tops and roving in. So that was that. So Kent Romney, the Romney sheep used to be called the Romney Marsh sheep, was mixed with a now extinct breed of Leicester sheep in the 19th century, and has become known as the Kent Romney sheep in UK because it's almost exclusively reared in Kent. Although it has also, the breed has been exported to 43 other countries around the world and is very popular in America, for example. It's got a long length, which makes it quite hard wearing, but it's also got quite a fine microfiber. Well, it has quite a large range of the size of the microfibers, so it can be quite coarse and strong enough to use in rugs, but also quite fine and good enough to be worn against the neck. And this is quite a fine, what's the word? The micron. Oh, what's the? I can't remember what it's called. Yeah, the fiber diameter is measured in microns, so I can't remember the name of. Well, I suppose it's the fiber diameter. It's a very popular top to be used by home spinners because it's quite forgiving because of the long staple length of the wool, and the fact it's very versatile as well. So there's a lovely picture in here of said sheep looking rather cold in the Kent countryside, I would assume, with snow on its face. So it could have been taken today, that picture. But it's a very nice. It's got a very the one I have is a very soft feel, so I'm guessing is quite a fine fibre. This is a very useful book for learning all about different types of wool, and I do enjoy looking through that. I got an interesting message on Messenger from my niece who is expecting a baby in July, which was a little bit sad in some ways and very touching and sweet in another way. She just messaged me that she was really sad that because my mother wasn't capable of knitting anymore, that there would be no one to make some handmade clothes for her baby, and if she sent me the wool, bought me the wool and that kind of thing, would I make some for her? Which, you know, as anybody knows with my stash, there's no need to buy me any wool. I've got plenty. So I obviously text her back and said, you know, I was actually already making something, so which I have. I've got a jacket almost finished. But then I thought, well, the baby's actually due in July. Most of the babies that I have made for, I've tended to make clothes for around about 3 to 6 months. And so the babies that I've been making for were all born in the end of August, September, which meant that I've made winter clothes effectively. This baby is being born in July, and I thought I would I'm making one jacket which will be suitable for Christmas, but I thought I'd make something in the 0 to 3 month size. So I thought, well, rather than use wool, I would use cotton. So I went into Mason's yesterday, actually not for this, but for something else, which I won't talk about this week. I will talk about that next week. But I went into Mason's and I looked around and I saw this Gossypium cotton by Erica Knight. Yeah. For those of you who may not be aware, Gossypium is the Latin name, the all cotton, all the 50 or so types of cotton plant are all in the Gossypiae genus. So Gossypium is derived from an Arabic word because cotton originated in the Middle East, which just means a soft thing. So a bit like gossamer would be in English, for example. So I thought this was quite a nice. It's not quite mustard yellow and it's not quite a brown. It's somewhere between yellow and brown. I'll leave it on this side because the light over there is causing the shadow to fall across it. So I got two 50-gram balls, and I decided I would make this sleeveless jacket called Muffin by Erica Knight. It's a very simple pattern, sleeveless, but with cut-in pockets. So it's a little bit of a challenge, but it's a very lightweight cotton vest, waistcoat, as we'd say in England, but vest as you might say in America. And I'll probably get a nice little shirt and trouser combination to go with this colour for him. So that will be 0 to 3 months. So that will, if we have a summer this summer, then my latest great nephew will be all set up for at least one day of the summer. So that was my main acquisition. Was this really soft baby cotton thread and a pattern. So, having bought that, I didn't buy anything else in Mason's, but I did get a couple of ideas for the project that I'm working on. I mentioned a couple of weeks ago that I was thinking of hosting a make-along for the summer. So if you're interested in the make-along, please do go along to the Ravelry group set up for this podcast, and I'm going to be putting some ideas about what I might do in there based upon a couple of ideas that I've had for summary items. So there's the beginnings of a nice little community going on the Ravelry group, but for it to become a proper community, we all have to play a part if we're interested. That is, of course, don't want to give the hard sell. There's no pressure to join the group, but through the group, I'll be able to offer prizes and occasional giveaways as well. So I'll put some more details in the thread that I've already opened about the summer make along, and see what you think, because I'm always open to good ideas and suggestions about things. So it would be very useful to be able to pick your brains, as it were, and get some good ideas about what could be made as part of a summer make along. And I'm calling it a make along because I crochet, I knit, I weave, I sew. Anything that, any craft that you take part in and you want to have a summary element to, will qualify for this make along. So by all means, if you simply crochet, it's a crochet along. If you simply knit, it's a knit along. If you simply sew, then it's a sew along. Excuse me. And I'm putting together some prizes. I've got a couple of things already, so I will be announcing what the prizes might be in the next week or two. Not least because I will be taking some annual leave from, well, I've got 1 week left in work, and then I'm off for Holy Week and Easter Week, which I normally take Holy Week and Easter Week off. There is the possibility that we being Bob, Wendy and myself, may be going up to Scarborough during Holy Week for a couple of days. If we do, then I'll probably do some filming while I'm up there. If we don't, then I will be working away on various projects and getting things done, and just preparing for Easter. And one of the ways I prepare for Easter is I watched Jesus of Nazareth, but I'll talk about that next week, because next week is my kind of holiday time, so I'll have the next 2 weeks off after I've finished work this week. So back to acquisitions. The Grocery Girls have started series 4 of Off Our Needles, and I can see now why Craftsy were doing what they were doing effectively, in that we've only had, I think, a week, maybe 2 weeks without the Grocery Girls, and now they're back on with their new series. And they launched the series on the 14th of March, which, according to the American and Canadian numbering of dates system, is because my understanding is Americans date things month, then date, then year, whereas in Britain we do things dates the month, then year. So 14th of March in the UK would be 14 of the 3rd, whereas in America it's the 3rd 14th day, so it's 314. And so 314 is known as Pi Day for that reason, that they're the first 3 digits of the number pi. And they were talking about pie shawls, and then mentioned a particular designer who had a lovely pie shawl. Now, the point about a pie shawl is that it's the increases in the shawl. It's a circular shawl to begin with, and the increases in the shawl maintain the approximate ratio of the diameter of the circle to its circumference that is what pi represents. And so they were showing this particular one, which is the Event Horizon pie shawl, which is there. And this is inside an ebook called Stories in Stitches, and it's volume 2. The book, there are a number of these books by Donna Dracunas and Ava Coleman. I don't know if that's how you say their name, but I'll hold it up there so that you can see it. They have, I think, I looked on their Ravelry page, and they have about half a dozen of these books. So it's not just a book of patterns, it's a book of stories relating to the patterns. Either the history of something, or an interview about something, or indeed effectively a short story concerning what the pattern represents, or the item represents, or a role that the item has played. They're normally available as books as well as ebooks, except for this one, which has sold out of the print copies. And you'll notice that I've got this half knocked off. It's the continuing frustration that in the UK we use the A1, A2, A3, A4 numbering system, and in the US they use the letter size. So there is a small difference between the sizes of our paper depending upon whether in the UK or the US, and it just means that my computer, I tell it to print on A4, I tell it to size things to A4, and then it prints them as A5. So it's slightly wider and slightly shorter. So anyway, it is what it is. It's not lost any of the detail on the patterns and the stories, so it's not the end of the world, but it's quite a hefty little book for, I think I got it for less than $10 as well, so that was quite a good value purchase. So it'd be interesting to, a couple of the volumes, to give you some ideas, was one was called The Civil War, one's the World Wars, and it's about the role that knitting and crocheting and other fibre-related arts have, how they were carried out, what materials were used, what they were making, and what they were making them for, kind of thing. So it's quite an interesting little program. So that's it in terms of my knitting kind of related. Well, no, it's not actually. Sorry, I do apologise. After I went into Mason's, I crossed the road and went to the Oxfam shop, which is a charity shop in Abingdon. I know that Oxfam have had... Sorry, I've got something in my... There we are. I know that Oxfam have had a little bit of bad publicity in the last few months, but they are broadly an organisation that does a great deal of good work, so I'm always happy to support them. But the one in Abingdon has a really good selection of books, and I'll talk about the other two books I bought shortly, but I always check in the craft section, because they do have some interesting books. And I saw this 55 crochet gifts for the home. This is actually quite I'd say an old book, but it's not that old. When was it printed? Yeah, it's 25 years ago, so it was 1993. And it's really nice because it takes you through the home. It's split up into different rooms, and there are some really nice patterns. I really like that cushion cover, for example. They do a lot of filet lace. So, for example, in the kitchen, I think it was. So you go from the hall to the... Yeah, sorry, in the hallway. This hallway obviously has windows that open out, and they've done some filet crochet in the back. So it's a filet crochet is basically where you use a chart such as this one to crochet the pattern. And so where it's all grey around here, that's obviously where the mesh is effectively, and then they're filled in where the darker colours are. And I thought, I do like this kind of thing. It's... Oh, what are we using? We are using a 2.5mm hooks, and we're using 3-ply crochet cotton. So it's not impossibly fine work. I think I would struggle if it were really tiny hooks and really tiny threads. But it appears to be... each of the blocks, where are we? Here we are, method. Start by making 344 chains. Whew, that's an awful lot. It's 85 by 4 plus 4. So, work 7 chains for the first space, 5 double trebles and 3 chains form the filet blocks. So, you do a double treble, in American would be a treble crochet. So, it's double trebles. So you do 5 double trebles for each of the dark squares, and then 3 chains for each of the spaces. And obviously if you then are working over a space of the line below, then you do the 5 double crochets into the 3 chain space. And that more or less maintains the dimensions of the square. But they also have in here an antimacassar, which I remember my great gran. Actually, it might have been my great aunt. I think I would be too young for it to be my great gran. I was about 4 when she died, maybe 5. It must have been my great aunt. She had antimacassars, and she called them anti-macs. And I thought, who is this anti-mac person? An antimacassar, for those of you who don't know, is it's the cloth that goes over, something like this, that goes over the back of a chair. And the reason it was used it was because from the 19th century onwards, men put macassar oil in their hair. And so obviously if they leant back on in a chair like that, then the oil would be transferred from their hair to the furniture, and so would stain the furniture and possibly ruin it. And so an anti-macassar was just a kind of piece of linen that you put over the back that protected this, and then you just took that off and washed it every so often. And of course, even after macassar oil stopped being used in the beginning of the 20th century, people were still using things like Brill cream and other hair products that might leak off onto chairs. And so the antimacassar really remained in place all the way through the 20th century, certainly through the middle part of the 20th century. By the end of the 20th century, people are not using that kind of product. Men in particular are not using that kind of product. And so they they became associated with old people's houses because they were so used to having chairs covered in grease and gunk from men's hair that they wouldn't have had them. I wouldn't have had a chair without one. And this is the pattern that they've got. So you can see this is the antimacassar. It goes over the back of the chair. And I really quite like the idea of that, although I'm not sure I would necessarily use it for that purpose. But I think a table runner made like that could actually be quite nice. And I certainly know 1 or 2 people who quite like them. So this is made using a piece of linen cloth and then lots of these circles made individually and then sewn together to make the pattern. So anyway, it's a bit of a blast from the past in a sense, but there's some nice ideas in there, so I think I'll probably be able to make some things. Excuse me while I just have a drink of water. Tea rather. So while I was in the Oxfam shop, I also saw a couple of history books. The first one is Rubicon, which is by Tom Holland, and is a very well-written book. It's had very positive reviews. Again, it's not that old. No, it's 2003, so it's 15 years old. But it's a very good history of the end of the Roman Republic and the rise of the Roman Empire. And Rubicon is obviously because Julius Caesar eventually crossed the Rubicon with an army, which was the phrase today, crossing the Rubicon, means that you've gone so far there's no turning back. Crossing the Rubicon in the Roman days of the Roman Republic was effectively treasonous because you were bringing an army to march on Rome, and no armies were allowed to cross the Rubicon for fear of overthrowing the Roman state and so on and so forth. So when Caesar marched his troops across the Rubicon, he marched beyond the point of no return, where he either won everything or lost everything. And of course, as we know, he both won and lost everything because he established himself effectively as the tyrant of Rome and was then assassinated in the Senate by his friends and fellow senators. So it's I'm just going to have to pause the video a second. So that was the first of the 2 books, and the second is part of the Oxford History of England, Anglo-Saxon England. I have dipped into these books many times when I was in the monastery doing bits of history and church history in particular. But to see a volume for very few, I think it was £4.99 this cost me. I mean, I'm almost tempted to see whether I can get the other volumes from second-hand shops and the like, but because it starts in Rome and Britain, goes all the way through to the end of the Second World War. This is the third edition, as it says on the front, and it's by Sir Frank Stenton. The overall editor of the series is Sir George Clarke, and this is a very fine and comprehensive history of England. And so some of the interesting things, for example, the 10th century Reformation of the English Church, which I kind of mentioned in passing in my tours of Abingdon. Bearing in mind that Abingdon Abbey was refounded in 975 AD, which would make it very much part of the 10th century reform that started and had its emphasis in Glastonbury, and Abingdon Abbey became the second abbey in the English congregation because of its affinity with the various holy men who, well, I say holy men, they were the various men who carried out the reform, and several of whom were canonised subsequently, although I do recognise that canonisation can just be a political statement in the eyes of some people, but this is really quite an interesting edition, and it's so I'll give you the various contents. There's the age of the migration, so that's the beginning of the Anglo-Saxons in England. The kingdoms of the southern English, so that's Essex, Wessex, Suffolk, and so on. The Anglian Northumbria, so that's the northeast of England. The conversion of the English people, that means the conversion to Christianity, obviously. The English Church from Theodore to Boniface. Well, Theodore was the second archbishop, or second or third Archbishop of Canterbury, and Boniface, of course, was the English monk who converted the Germans to Christianity and is the Apostle of Germany, and was Archbishop of Mainz before his death. And his relics are stored in the cathedral at Mainz, as well as I understand. Then there's learning and literature, the ascendancy of the Mercian kings, which is the Midlands. Then the age of Alfred the Great, the structure of early English society, the conquest of Scandinavian England, because when Alfred was king, the England was divided in two. Above and to the north and east of the River Thames was the Danelaw, and to the south and west of the River Thames was the Kingdom of Wessex, ruled by Alfred. And gradually Alfred and his successors began to reconquer large parts of Viking England, with the Danelaw, which had come in from Northumbria through York and had spread southwards, and so was being pushed back towards the northeast, and is why Oxford is such an important place in the early medieval world in particular. There were a number of treaties signed at Oxford Abbey, which is a ruined abbey which no longer exists. There's no trace of it anywhere, but is thought to be to the immediate west of the town centre in Oxford, at Osney, which is on the banks of the Thames, because the Thames was the meeting point between Wessex and the Danelaw, and so the Danes and the English signed a number between the rivers. So, hence then the decline of the Old English monarchy, England and the Scandinavian world, because what's often forgotten is that a number of the kings of England before the conquest were actually Scandinavian, King Canute being probably the most famous. And indeed, King Harold, immediately before losing the Battle of Hastings, had previously, within a couple of weeks, just won the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where a Scandinavian king was attempting to claim the throne of England for himself after the death of Edward. So, Harold had already successfully defended his claim to the throne once, and unfortunately for him, failed at the second time of asking in short succession. Then there's the 10th century Reformation, England before the conquest, and then the last years of the Old English state, and the Norman conquest and the Norman settlement, followed by the reorganisation of the English Church and the establishment of the Anglo-Norman state, which is pretty much the one that was in place all the way through until the time of Henry VIII. So, fascinating book. I shall enjoy reading that when I get some time. As if I ever do. So that's all my acquisitions. So I thought I would talk a little bit today about some of the most... The big news of the week, in many respects, in England was the death of Professor Hawking, Stephen Hawking. I know it seems... Well, there is a lot of misunderstanding about the nature of the relationship between science and religion. And some of that misunderstanding comes from a fundamentalist approach on the religious side, but also comes from a fundamentalist approach on the scientific side. So, Stephen Hawking was probably one of the most, certainly of his time, was one of the cleverest people of his age, and is one of the top 10 cleverest people who've ever lived. And what makes his achievement all the more remarkable is the fact that he suffered from a form of motor neuron disease, which ought to have killed him 40 years ago. And I say ought to have killed him because it's a muscle degenerating disease which actually prevents the body from sustaining itself, even from the heart beating, let alone the lungs breathing and all the other bits and pieces that are essential for life. So even if he'd only lived for 40 years, that in itself would have been a remarkable achievement for someone suffering from MND. And 2 years is probably an optimistic prognosis, as it were. What makes I keep wanting to say Richard, I'm sorry, Stephen Hawking. What makes Hawking all the more remarkable is that whilst suffering from this massively degenerative and debilitating condition, he was able to participate in some of the most groundbreaking discoveries in theoretical physics. Now, a little bit of a rider here. I say groundbreaking discoveries. The problem with theoretical physics is that it's very difficult to establish empirical evidence to support the theoretical framework. That doesn't thereby undermine the theoretical framework, it just means the use of the word discovery. It's not like discovering penicillin, it's not like discovering how to make steel using iron. But it's a form of discovery which is no less valid, but much less concrete. It's more abstract. And what makes it yet more remarkable still is that Hawking did all this whilst completely unable to write on a board, write on a piece of paper, jot down ideas so that he recalled them later, just work through equations. He had to work through equations in his mind. And that is, for anyone who has any mathematical understanding or training whatsoever, it's very easy, even when writing down your workings through equations, to make mistakes. And you can sit there looking at the piece of paper afterwards thinking, well, it's not the right answer. So I started at the right point and I finished at the wrong point. So somewhere in between I've made an error, either in logic or I've written down the number wrong or whatever it is. He had to do that largely in his mind, and that makes it an even more phenomenal achievement, what he managed to achieve, including, for example, the discovery, or at least positing the idea of what's known now as Hawking radiation, which most cosmologists and theoretical physicists accept is true, although proving it is going to be nigh on impossible. We all know about black holes, in that we know that they exist and what they mean, that they are areas in space which are super dense and are so dense that even light can't escape the gravitational pull of the dense mass at the heart of the black hole. And so they're black because they're invisible effectively. We can see where they are because of the way things around them react, rather than because we can see them. Because obviously this is a super massive, dense object in space which has a gravitational effect on other things around it in space. And the idea in a black hole is that you can get closer and closer to a black hole, but there is a point beyond which, if you go beyond that point, you will be inexorably pulled into the black hole under the force of its gravity. And so that point, as it were, is part of what is known as the event horizon of the black hole. So it's obviously, a black hole will be broadly spherical in shape, and so the event horizon is broadly a sphere that surrounds the black hole, beyond which, if you go in, you'll never come out. And so Hawking understood that there was a problem here, in that the idea of conservation of energy means that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And so if matter goes into the black hole, and matter is a form of energy, fundamentally, if matter goes into the black hole, it must then, either the black hole simply absorbs all that energy into itself, or some of it must escape. And the problem for physics is that it has to escape in a predictable format, otherwise none of the so-called laws of the universe, laws of physics, would actually be laws, because every time something came into contact with a black hole, it would be changed in a mysterious way from what it was to something completely different. And there was no way of predicting what that would be. Now, I'm not a theoretical physicist. I'm a mathematician by training. I grasp some of the ideas. I'm not necessarily explaining them fully, but I've written down a couple of notes, so I'm going to read a couple of things. So there is a fundamental issue, here we are, with science and religion, which is the role of free will, effectively. The scientific method of the Enlightenment, and therefore of the modern period, was best summed up by a mathematician and philosopher whose name was Pierre-Simon Laplace, who died at the beginning of the 19th century. And he said of scientific determinism, if we know the state of the universe at one time, the laws of science will determine it at all future and past times. So the point there is that effectively, if we can know everything about a specific moment, we can predict everything forward and backwards from that moment. We can predict what must have happened in order to lead to that moment, and what will inevitably happen because of that moment. And of course, that sounds perfectly logical until you realize that that's not just talking about inanimate matter, that's also talking about human beings. Because we're part of the physical universe, and so the role that we play in that physical universe is either a role of free will on the part of each individual person to choose what to do, and so have a knock-on effect on the state of the universe, or it's completely irrelevant what we do, that the universe will continue to operate in a particular way, and so what we do is not so much irrelevant as determined by the laws of physics and the previous state of the universe, that we can only act in particular ways, even if we delude ourselves into thinking that we could optionally act in a different way. Not unsurprisingly, the Church does not accept this point of view. But for Hawking and other theoretical physicists, of course, it's immensely important. Now, Laplace was writing at the beginning of the 19th century. At the end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century, there is a quantum leap in physics, and that was an intended pun. Excuse me a second. Which meant that, well, it didn't mean that. It was a quantum leap that happened with the discovery of the idea of subatomic physics, quantum mechanics, hence the pun. And Einstein was not very keen on quantum mechanics because he thought it inelegant and unpredictable, and so was very disquieted by it. He didn't not accept it, but he wasn't happy about it. We've all, probably many of us will have heard of Schrödinger's cat, which is a thought experiment by Erwin Schrödinger in the 1920s, I think it was. Might have been 1930s, who, to demonstrate what quantum... No, I'll start that again. There is a fundamental issue with quantum mechanics, which is that you can know the more that you know the position of a subatomic particle, the less you can know about its momentum and angular momentum and momentum. And vice versa. So the more you know about how fast something is moving and the direction in which it's moving, the less you can know about its position. Now, for many people this, and for Schrödinger to an extent, although Schrödinger's cat is a good thought experiment in that it forces people to think about the consequences, because what Schrödinger was doing was identifying the idea that if you put a cat in a box with a vial of poison, which will be broken if a radioactive particle is emitted from a radioactive isotope, then because of quantum mechanics, the isotope has emitted the radiation and has not emitted the radiation, which means that the vial has been broken and has not been broken. And because a cat is made up of molecules and atoms, then under the quantum mechanics of those individual atoms, the cat is both alive and dead. And the only way of knowing whether it's alive or dead is to open the box and see whether or not it is alive or dead. And then you know everything that you can know about the quantum state of the cat, the vial, and the isotope. But you can't know how fast something is decaying. And therefore, you can't know whether it's triggered or not. Sorry, that wasn't abundantly clear, but it's a very difficult idea. And what was established by the thought idea was that actually macroscopic objects like human beings and cats, because we are complex systems, the simple quantum knowledge doesn't simply apply. And of course that means that there must be a barrier between the quantum world and the macro world, and we didn't know until really 1945, when actually Schrödinger himself wrote 1944 I think, he wrote a book which talked about macro systems like cats and dogs, that we would have to cool them to just above absolute zero in order to be able to study the quantum effects within each of the atoms that make up the complex system. So, I know all of that is very complicated, but the point was that he was building on the Heisenberg principle, which is that you can either know the position of something with extreme precision and not know anything about its momentum, or you can know the momentum of something with extreme precision and know nothing about its position. And that this isn't an effect of... It was for a long time thought that this was an effect of the object being observed, that it was the interaction of the observer with the object being observed. But actually, subsequent studies have shown that this is an innate property of subatomic systems. I am coming to the point of all this, which is that one of the problems with this scientific determinism is that if you can't know the what was it? If we know the state of the universe at one time, then the laws of science determine everything before and after. But of course, under the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, you can't know exactly. What you can have is a probability distribution of the likely positions and speeds of everything. And so what Hawking believed, and actually was quite open about this belief, so I'm not putting words into his mouth. What he basically believed was that there is no space in the quantum understanding of the origin of the universe for a creator God. And the reason for that is that there is only ever a probability distribution of the type of universe that could exist, rather than a certainty that this universe was the one that would have to exist from the Big Bang. And that's all related to quantum state physics. And to put that another way, to put it in the words of Richard Dawkins, whose name I keep confusing with Stephen Hawking, which is why I keep saying Richard instead of Stephen, effectively, the universe we have is just by chance. Now, I find that a fundamentally dissatisfying explanation for the creation of the universe, for the existence of this particular universe in this particular way. And this is where, although I think Professor Hawking was a great man and a great thinker and an outstanding mind, I think he was wrong on this point. That the idea that it's just chance is the reason why things are the way they are is simply not. It's not a satisfying explanation. It may be what the evidence of science points to, but that, for me, is... I think it makes more sense on a rational level for me to say that the universe is the way it was because it was created by God to be that way, than it is for a scientist of this standing to say it just happens to be this way and it could have been completely different. As an explanation for the universe, I find that very, very lacking. Even though I accept the theoretical framework that leads you to that conclusion, just because you're being led to a conclusion doesn't mean you have to accept the conclusion, that there is still the open possibility of alternative thoughts. And this brings me to something that was said, that the document, I think, was Dei Filius, Son of God, from the First Vatican Council, which met mostly in 1870. It was opened at the end of 1869, but sat in 1870, just before the Franco-Prussian War. And the council only had two documents it could publish, and only one of them of any consequence, which was Dei Filius, on faith and reason. And as is the want with Vatican documents or church documents, there are anathemas issued at the end of the documents, which sound terrible to our ears, but anathemas doesn't imply any violence on the part of the statement. It was often interpreted that way, and so it is an unfortunate way of terming these things. But what it really says is that this is not a satisfactory position to hold, and that you are outside of the fold if you hold these views. And there were two. It was a rather fine balancing act, and I think this has been the role of the church through the millennia. Actually, this rather fine balancing act between the role of natural reason and the role of supernatural revelation. I think I've got a note on it somewhere. So, yes, there we are. I actually wrote down that I think it's a letter to the Romans. St. Paul's letter to the Romans has a great deal on how Gentiles, non-Jews, could come to know of the Jewish God, even without having the revelation of the Jewish scriptures, that there are enough clues in the way in which the world is ordered and works that could lead people to the truth about the existence of this particular divine being. And he also puts down a rather pithy phrase, really, explaining what faith is. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. But both St. Paul and the Church in the First Vatican Council were very keen to point out that there are two forms of knowledge. There is divine revelation, God revealing himself, which is supernatural, and there is human reason coming to an understanding of God through the world in which you live, which is natural reason. And that they both work in tandem. They're not in opposition to each other. But there will be occasions when supernatural revelation takes priority over divine understanding. So in the case of the origin of the universe, I would say this is a moment when divine revelation takes over from natural reason. There are, however, occasions when natural reason supersede what we think is divine revelation, and this is where we have to be very careful. I am not a creationist. I do not believe that God created the world in 6 days, in the way in which it's written in Scripture. I do not believe that all animals were created as they now are, that I believe in evolution. Now, I say both of those things, and I remain fully in concord with the Catholic Church, because I say I don't believe in the creation account in the way in which it's written. Well, there are actually two creation accounts in the New Testament, in the Old Testament, and they contradict each other about the order of creation, because they're not there as scientific manuals. They are there to explain deeper truths about the nature of the creative acts of God. So I do believe in the creation as written, but not... I believe it to be literally true, but literally needs to be fully understood. That what I think it means, if it contradicts scientific discovery, then God's revelation, which cannot be wrong, cannot literally mean what it might seem to mean if it's contradicting what is known by natural reason. Evolution is another, and it is a good example of where the Church has changed its view on the way in which creation happens in order to accommodate natural reason, but also still asserts the priority of divine revelation. So, for example, the Church still maintains that there is a single couple, Adam and Eve, from whom humans are descended. That whatever the natural process that led to the original Adam and Eve, there is but one Adam and but one Eve, and so there cannot be, in natural reason, if there appears to be multiple origins of the human species, then that has to be wrong. That they've chosen the wrong starting point, if you like. And so this is not a new controversy either. This is a controversy that Tertullian in the 3rd century, St. Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century, St. Thomas Aquinas in the 12th century, all of these men were writing about the apparent conflict between divine revelation and human reason. It is a modern cliche almost to say that the medieval church and the medieval world believed in a flat earth. No, they didn't. Nobody since the Greeks has seriously thought that the earth was flat. Everybody knows we were living on a sphere, or a spheroid, as we now know, but it is a misrepresentation of reality because the church and other religious authorities in other parts of the world acknowledged the limits of divine revelation, whilst at the same time acknowledging the limits of human reason, that the two work in tandem, that sometimes one has to change its understanding in order to accommodate the other, and vice versa. So Stephen Hawking was a very important figure, a very remarkable man, a brilliant thinker, and occasionally was wrong. is all I have to say. But still should be celebrated as being the great example of human striving that he was. So I think I'll leave it at that. I hope I've not rambled too excessively on these matters. Just to leave that subject completely behind, Professor Brian Cox, who is a British scientist and does lots of TV programs on physics. He's a theoretical physicist as well. He wrote a book with a colleague on quantum mechanics and quantum theory, and says at the very beginning, I can't remember who he quotes, but basically, if you think you understand quantum physics, then you don't. And it is very much like that. It's a theory of the universe which appears to be consistent, but is impossible to understand because it actually, in some ways, throws over everything that we intuitively understand about the world in which we live. Anyway, I'll leave it at that. But if you have any comments on the things I'm saying, any corrections that you think I need to make, then I'm more than happy to hear from you in the comments. On that note, I will say goodbye for now and speak to you all again next week. So until then, stay happy, stay well, stay safe, and keep crafting. So bye for now.